There is a photograph that no one should ever have seen. It was taken in a hospital in Havana in February 2013. In it, three people stand around a bed. The man in that bed is no longer the man Venezuela once knew. The tubes connected to his body tell a story that no official statement would admit for weeks. And the looks on those three children's faces reveal something that goes beyond politics. The absolute terror of realizing that everything is about to end. For years, that image stayed hidden on protected servers, guarded obsessively by the people who understood that if it ever became public, it could change the course of a nation. Because there are truths that don't disappear. They just wait for the exact moment to be told. Venezuela lived for 14 years under the spell of a voice. He wasn't simply another president in the long line of leaders the country had known. He was the man who would call the state TV channel at 3 in the morning to sing songs from his childhood while millions watched him in pajamas. The one who would stop an entire military parade, step down from the platform, break protocol, and hug elderly women in the street who cried just from seeing him. The one who delivered 7-hour speeches without a single sheet of paper, without a script, as if the whole country were his living room, and every Venezuelan was a guest he needed to tell absolutely everything. The plazas filled not just with bodies, but with something more dangerous, more intoxicating, pure faith. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could watch him pass like they were witnessing something sacred. 50-year-old men cried openly when he mentioned their forgotten towns in the interior. Elderly women brought photos of dead relatives so he could bless them from the stage. Venezuela didn't just change governments in 1998. It changed rhythm, language, collective dreams, national identity. The social missions arrived like an avalanche in neighborhoods where the state had never set foot in 200 years of republic. Hospitals filled with Cuban doctors who treated people for free at 3 in the morning. Schools received Kanema computers for kids who had never touched a keyboard. Elderly people who had worked on farms their whole lives received pensions for the first time. The poor, the forgotten, the invisible people who had always been invisible, felt for the first time that someone was actually seeing them. But then came the expropriations that left entire families out on the street, the violent clashes during marches that ended with bodies on the ground, the mandatory national broadcasts that cut into programming for hours so presidential speeches could be transmitted, speeches no one could escape. The country split cleanly into two halves that stopped speaking to each other, stopped sharing spaces, stopped recognizing each other as compatriots. And in the middle of that brutal division, behind the guarded walls of Miraflores, a family was learning the rules of a game no one had explained to them, and for which there was no instruction manual. Because being the child of the man who was simultaneously the most loved and most hated person in Venezuela did not come with any training. Life was profoundly strange, not luxurious in the European palace with crystal chandelier scents, but watched with a claustrophobic intensity. Any family meal could be violently interrupted by an emergency call about the nation. Any planned weekend could be canceled by a diplomatic crisis with the United States. Birthdays were celebrated surrounded by ministers sweating through guayaberas and bodyguards with earpieces. Family conversations about ordinary things stopped abruptly when an advisor walked in with urgent documents that needed an immediate signature. And the children learned something that would mark their minds forever. Their father didn't really belong to them. He belonged to Venezuela, to the 22 million people who waited for his words every Sunday on Allo Presidente. They only had him on loan during minutes stolen between national broadcasts, during rushed breakfasts before cabinet meetings, in late-night phone calls when he was traveling. They grew up with the bitter certainty that one day their father would become a chapter in school textbooks. What they didn't know, what they couldn't anticipate, was that when that day finally came, it would leave them completely alone and exposed in front of a country that doesn't distinguish between a leader and his blood, between a symbol and the real people who carry his last name. And when in June 2011, the word cancer was spoken for the first time on national television, when the Comandante appeared on screen admitting the illness he had hidden for months, the clock began its irreversible countdown. The urgent trips to Cuba became weekly, then constant. Presidential absences multiplied until Venezuela had a ghost president. And inside those long absences, inside those official silences, the government tried to fill desperately with patriotic music and canned messages of hope. The children lived their own private, invisible hell, watching their father die slowly, while the country demanded obsessively that he remain immortal. There were moments in those final 2 years when the performance became impossible to sustain. Chávez appeared in recorded videos, swollen from steroids, completely bald, repeating words of encouragement that sounded emptier each time. And his children watched those clips on TV in Caracas, knowing the images were days old, knowing that at that exact moment, their father might be far worse than what the camera showed. The gap between the public image and the private reality became an abyss. In December 2012, Chávez traveled to Cuba for his fourth operation. He didn't come back. For 3 months, Venezuela lived in a Kafkaesque constitutional limbo. There was an elected president who couldn't be sworn in because he was intubated in Havana. There was a government operating without its leader. There was a country frozen, waiting for news that didn't arrive. On the night of March 5, 2013, when Vice President Nicolas Maduro finally appeared on national television, with eyes completely red, his voice breaking from crying, and said the words everyone was waiting for and no one wanted to hear, Venezuela stopped. It literally froze. The streets emptied instantly, like a post-apocalyptic movie. Shops slammed their doors shut. Public transportation stopped running. Millions cried in their homes as if they had lost a biological father. State TV aired 18 straight hours of funeral footage while an endless crowd filed past the coffin. And millions of others, in the calculated privacy of closed homes, opened bottles of champagne in secret, celebrating the end of an era they considered disastrous. But in a private room, far from the cameras broadcasting the public spectacle of national mourning, 3 siblings looked at each other, not knowing what to do or what to say, because nobody had ever told them how you live the day after being the Comandante's child. Nobody had explained that, from that precise moment on, every decision they made would be interpreted politically, that every silence would be suspicious, that every word would be dissected by analysts on TV. The cameras hunted them obsessively throughout the state funeral. Tight zooms on their faces searching for tears, aerial shots of their hands clasped together, real-time analyses of their expressions by improvised psychologists. They weren't children moving through a normal, private grief. They were content for 24-hour news cycles that needed to fill airtime. And while the entire country argued passionately about the legacy, while some prepared eternal tributes and others wrote endless lists of accusations, they tried to answer the simplest, most impossible question. So now what do we do with our lives? The rumors about hidden fortunes began before the body was even cold in the grave, that there were billions tucked away in numbered Swiss accounts, that there were luxury properties in Caribbean islands bought through front men, that there were investments in tax havens contradicting every socialist speech. International media began publishing investigations with numbers that swung wildly, 100 million according to some, 500 million according to others, 2 billion according to the boldest. Nobody presented undeniable proof, but the figures circulated like established truths in serious headlines. And in the middle of that devastating media hurricane, the 3 siblings took paths so radically different that it was like they'd been born into completely different families, raised with opposite values, processing the same experience from parallel universes. Because there's something no one tells you about families of power. The same last name can become completely opposite things, depending on who carries it and how they decide to carry it. For a long time, their stories remained fragmented, buried under industrial layers of official propaganda and opposition resentment. But truth has a stubborn way of eventually leaking out, and these truths, in particular, deserve to be told not from sectarian hate or blind worship, but from the simple curiosity of understanding what it means to grow up under the gaze of millions. Rosa Virginia Chávez Rodriguez was 37 years old when her father attempted the coup that changed Venezuelan history. 37. She was already an adult with her own story, already a mother to several children, already someone who had lived a marriage with its joys and a divorce with its pain. She had carefully built a stable life in Barinas, where no one knew her as the daughter of, but simply as Rosa. She worked as a teacher in a public school in the interior. She taught elementary kids to read and write. She paid her bills with a modest salary. She went to the market on Saturdays without an escort. She rode public buses. She lived in a simple house she had bought with a bank loan. And then in February 1992, in the space of 48 hours, her last name became the only thing that mattered about her. Everything else was erased. People who knew her in those confusing days say Rosa Virginia wanted nothing to do with the media circus. When reporters started hunting her like hounds, she literally hid in relatives' homes. She refused every interview. She avoided cameras as if they were weapons. She desperately tried to keep her life intact, her routine, her normal identity. But she discovered something terrifying. Some last names don't let you choose, and Chávez had become one of them. During the long 2 years her father was imprisoned in Yari, she visited him regularly every 2 weeks. And there, inside a prison where time moved differently, she saw something no one else got to witness: a live transformation, a failed military man turning into a political leader with a vision. She watched other inmates seek him out to solve conflicts the guards couldn't handle. She watched visitors line up for hours just to hear him speak during visiting hours, notebooks in hand to take notes. Her father wasn't serving a sentence passively. He was earning an intensive master's degree in practical politics from a cell 3 meters by 4. When he was released in 1994 and immediately started the campaign many people thought was suicidal, Rosa Virginia still resisted the public role. She went to some rallies when he specifically asked her. She appeared in a few family photos published by the press, but she stayed deliberately on the movement's edges. She didn't give speeches, she didn't grant interviews, she didn't sit in strategy meetings. She was present when absolutely necessary and absent the rest of the time. And that's how it was through the entire 14-year presidency. Visible only on key dates like birthdays and movement anniversaries, then back to the shadows until March 2013. That exact night, when the official announcement finally confirmed what everyone already knew, Rosa Virginia was in Caracas at a relative's home, and something fundamental shifted inside her instantly. People close to her who were there say it was like someone flipped a switch in her brain. Like when Rosa Virginia went to sleep and a different one woke up. Suddenly, without any visible transition, the woman who had spent more than 20 years actively avoiding the spotlight became the official guardian of the legacy. She began appearing at every single commemorative act without exception, always impeccably dressed in intense red, the movement's symbolic color, always with a serious but controlled expression that projected strength, always delivering a brief but forceful message about the eternal relevance of her father's ideas. And her political relationship with Nicolás Maduro became symbiotic in ways few people anticipated. He desperately needed the historical legitimacy only she could grant with her last name. She needed the media platform and protection only he could provide from power. They became mutually dependent political allies, without either of them ever saying it explicitly in public. In private meetings within the top levels of Chavismo, Rosa Virginia's presence validated decisions. Her silence questioned them. She developed power that didn't come from a formal title, but from pure symbolic authority. But there is one story very few people outside the inner circle know, one that reveals a lot about who Rosa Virginia really is. In April 2017, when anti-government protests exploded violently and Venezuela lived through the 3 most brutal months of its recent history, when every day brought images of young people facing off against armored vehicles, Rosa Virginia began receiving explicit death threats. These weren't vague threats from anonymous trolls. They were specific messages with details only someone with real information could know. They sent her photos of her house taken from different angles. They sent the full names of her grandchildren and the schools they attended. They sent schedules of her movements. The most radical wing of the opposition, the faction that had lost all hope in peaceful methods, had turned her into a priority target. For 6 straight weeks, she lived with real physical fear. Not the abstract fear of exposure or criticism, but animal fear. Fear of opening the front door and finding someone waiting with a gun. Fear her grandchildren would be kidnapped on the way to school. Fear someone would plant a bomb in her car. Her children begged her through tears to leave the country temporarily until things calmed down, to go to Cuba where she'd be protected, to go to Mexico where she has relatives, to go anywhere but Venezuela. But Rosa Virginia refused flatly. She said something people who were in that tense family conversation later repeated. My father faced a military trial that could have sentenced him to 30 years. My father spent 2 years in prison without guarantees. My father didn't run when they threatened to kill him in the coup years. I'm not going to run now either. If they kill me, they kill me here. And she stayed. She kept showing up at massive public events. She kept defending the legacy with the same firmness. She remained the familiar, visible face of Chavismo at its most vulnerable moment. That decision marked her deeply because it confirmed something she had probably already suspected, that her personal identity had become completely fused with her father's political project, that there was no longer a Rosa Virginia separable from the legacy of Hugo Chávez, that her life only made sense insofar as it preserved that historical memory. It is undoubtedly a form of filial, love real, sincere, but it is also a form of personal disappearance, of slowly erasing oneself in order to become an extension of another, of sacrificing individuality on the altar of legacy. Today, when Rosa Virginia speaks at a March 5th commemorative event, she uses the same vocal cadences her father used, the same calculated dramatic pauses before key phrases, the same emphasis on certain words, the same hand gestures. It is not conscious imitation nor parody. It is something deeper and more unsettling. It is channeling, as if the Comandante's spirit were literally speaking through her. Her devoted followers see it as a beautiful and necessary continuity. Her fiercest critics see it as a pathological inability to develop a voice of her own. The truth is that both interpretations probably contain fragments of reality. Rosa Virginia currently lives in Caracas, in a house in the eastern part of the city protected like a military fortress, with permanent armed escorts, security cameras on every corner, and strict protocols for every outing. She can no longer do basic things most people take for granted. She can't go grocery shopping herself. She can't walk through a public square without triggering a security operation. She can't sit in a cafe just to have a coffee. Her life is an unchanging sequence of official events, private meetings with Chavista leaders, and commemorations of the legacy. It is a life with a clear and undeniable purpose, but with absolutely zero personal freedom. And when she is asked on those rare occasions, when she grants a brief, tightly controlled interview to a friendly outlet, whether she misses her old life, the simple life in Barinas, where she was just a teacher who went to the market on Saturdays, she pauses for a long moment. She looks toward some undefined point on the horizon. She smiles with a sadness she cannot fully hide and says calmly that life no longer exists anywhere, and the person who lived that life doesn't exist anymore either. She died the same day my father died. It may be the most honest and most heartbreaking answer someone in her position could give. But if Rosa Virginia Chávez is the sister who embraced the legacy until dissolving into it, María Gabriela Chávez is exactly the opposite, the one who fled from it like a burning building. And her story is so different, it feels as though they grew up on different planets. María Gabriela Chávez Colmenares was born on September 9, 1983, at the height of Venezuela's oil boom in the 1980s. She was only 8 years old when the coup turned her father into a national figure. 15 when he won the presidency, 29 when he died. And unlike Rosa Virginia, who had 3 full decades of normal life before the hurricane, María Gabriela never truly knew life without a camera following her. She grew up systematically framed as the pretty daughter of the Comandante. The state media adored her with an intensity that bordered on obscene. She fit Western beauty standards perfectly. She smiled easily for cameras. She spoke confidently in public. She had long, shiny hair fashion magazines loved to photograph. She was deliberately turned into the unofficial princess of the Bolivarian Revolution, and she, in her early 20s, without real-life experience to compare against, genuinely believed that was her natural role in the world. She began appearing regularly at international events representing Venezuela, delivering speeches written by advisors about youth and social transformation at UN forums. She posed for magazines that presented her as the young, modern face of Chavismo. She became the unofficial media heir, and she enjoyed it. Or at least, it looked like she did in the photos. There is one photograph from September 2010 that perfectly captures that golden era. María Gabriela is standing in the main hall of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. She is wearing a designer red dress that probably cost several $1,000s. Her hair is perfectly styled in professional waves. Her makeup is flawless. She is smiling directly at the camera with the absolute confidence of someone who knows she belongs exactly in that space of power. Behind her, out of focus, are the flags of every UN member state. She is there representing Venezuela at just 26 years old. That image immediately flooded Venezuelan state media. It made newspaper front pages. It became television content. It was living proof that Chavismo was young, modern, cosmopolitan, international, capable of competing on the global stage. But none of those enthusiastic outlets stopped to ask what she actually felt behind that perfectly calibrated smile. Whether that confidence was genuine or the result of years of Pavlovian conditioning, whether she was there because she truly wanted to represent her country or because it was expected of her and refusing was unthinkable. 3 years later, in March 2013, her father died. And barely 2 months after a grief she had no time to process, Maria Gabriela received the official appointment that would generate more media controversy than any other in recent Venezuelan diplomatic history: alternate ambassador of Venezuela to the United Nations. The position seemed tailor-made for her, and it unleashed a storm. Alternate ambassador at 29 years old, with no diplomatic career, no experience in foreign service, no formal studies in international relations, no background in foreign policy, just a last name heavy with history. Opposition media, both national and international, tore her apart with a ferocity that bordered on the personal. They publicly accused her of shameless, insulting nepotism. They compared her to Chelsea Clinton, who at least had degrees from elite universities, to daughters of African dictators who inherited ministries, to every historical example of aristocratic privilege clumsily disguised as meritocracy. And brutally speaking, they were probably right at the core of the criticism. By any professional standard, she was not qualified for the role. But it is also true that no one with the last name Chávez could ever be evaluated objectively in Venezuela. It was structurally impossible. Every action was political by definition. Every success was automatically suspicious. Every failure was irrefutable proof of inherited incompetence. Maria Gabriela arrived in New York in May 2013 with the entire country watching. For nearly 2 years, she honestly tried to do the job. She attended every scheduled meeting punctually. She carefully read the briefings prepared by career diplomats. She delivered the speeches written for her. She voted according to instructions from Caracas. But people who worked directly with her at the Venezuelan mission during that period described something revealing. Beneath the polished surface, she seemed deeply unhappy. In private team meetings, she spoke very little, only when directly asked. She systematically avoided socializing with other young diplomats at obligatory cocktail events. She would return to her Manhattan apartment as soon as official events ended, declining invitations as if she were serving a sentence, as if every day required sheer force of will. And then in 2015 came the media blow that changed her life forever. A Spanish newspaper with international reach, Diario ABC, published an explosive investigation claiming Maria Gabriela Chávez personally held assets worth $4 billion. $4 billion. The number was so absurd, so wildly disproportionate, that even some moderate opposition voices publicly questioned it. How exactly does a 31-year-old accumulate $4 billion? Doing what? Selling what? The math made no sense, but the media damage was irreversible. The story spread worldwide in hours. CNN covered it. The BBC mentioned it. Newspapers in 50 countries reproduced it. The multimillionaire daughter of the socialist president who preached equality. The narrative was journalistically perfect for critics of Chavismo. Revolutionary hypocrisy condensed into one young, photogenic figure. The Venezuelan government denied everything vehemently. Maduro himself called it a media war orchestrated by imperialism. The foreign ministry threatened international lawsuits. But Maria Gabriela herself said absolutely nothing. Not a word, no statement, no interview, total silence. And that silence was universally interpreted as guilt, as the inability to defend the indefensible. What very few outlets reported, because it couldn't be verified, was what allegedly happened privately during those weeks. There are accounts circulating in diplomatic circles, second and third-hand testimonies, rumors among people who worked at the UN. They say Maria Gabriela suffered a serious nervous breakdown, that she stopped going to the mission entirely, that she spent 3 weeks locked in her apartment, that she called her family in Venezuela crying uncontrollably, saying she couldn't take it anymore, that the pressure was unbearable, that every time she went out to buy milk, she felt everyone on the street was looking at her like a thief. True or exaggerated? Impossible to confirm. What is verifiable is that she disappeared from public life. She resigned from her diplomatic post without a formal public announcement. She left New York without saying goodbye to her colleagues and began a nomadic life between Europe and the Caribbean. Madrid for 6 months, Paris for 4, Dubai for a while. Big cities where nobody really knows Venezuelan history, where the last name Chavez means nothing to the average person, where she can sit in a cafe without being recognized. Today in 2025, Maria Gabriela Chávez is 42 years old, and literally no one knows for certain where she lives. There are occasional unconfirmed sightings. Someone swears they saw her in a luxury restaurant in Barcelona last year. Another claims she lives permanently on a private Caribbean island under a false name. Some even speculate she's in Miami under a completely new identity. Her Instagram account, which once had 2 million active followers, has been completely inactive since 2016. Her last public post was an artistic photo of an empty beach at sunset, no people. No caption, no hashtags, no location. Just golden sand and endless ocean. Like a desperate subliminal message. Let me disappear in peace. And Venezuela let her go. She's no longer front-page news. She no longer generates headlines. She became a ghost of her own story. The symbolic heir who rejected the inheritance. The princess who fled the poison kingdom. But there is something that probably still haunts her wherever she's hiding. The unanswered question of whether the $4 billion were real or invented. Whether that fortune exists in some numbered account or was a cruel media fabrication. And the brutal truth is that we will probably never know for certain, because she consciously chose silence as a survival strategy. And in her case, silence was the only form of psychological survival that didn't completely destroy her. But perhaps the most fascinating story of all, the most unexpected and subversive, is that of Hugo Rafael Chávez Colmenares, because while his two sisters struggled with the legacy in radically opposite ways, he did something no one anticipated. He decided that the legacy did not have to define him. Hugo Rafael was born on September 9, 1983, on the exact same day as Maria Gabriela. They are twins, although almost no one talks about it publicly, because it disrupts the media narrative built around each of them. And from the earliest childhood, they were completely different, as if nature had designed them to be perfect opposites. While Maria Gabriela instinctively sought out cameras like flowers turning toward the sun, Hugo Rafael avoided them like a vampire avoids light. While she genuinely enjoyed official events full of people, he hid in his room with any excuse he could find. While she developed social skills to navigate the world of power, he developed athletic skills to escape that world entirely. There is one anecdote from 2001 that reveals everything about Hugo Rafael. Chávez organized a massive event in the gardens of Miraflores to celebrate his twins' 18th birthday, the legal age of adulthood in Venezuela. He invited hundreds of people from the government, ministers with their spouses, lawmakers from the MBR, famous pro-government artists. There was a huge stage with a professional sound system, live music from a hired orchestra, luxury catering for 500 people, colored lights illuminating the trees. It was a state event disguised as a family party. Maria Gabriela was radiant. She danced salsa with ministers 3 times her age, greeted every guest enthusiastically, posed smiling for hundreds of photos. It was her moment, and she knew it. Hugo Rafael arrived exactly at 8 o'clock, when the party was starting, dressed in casual sportswear that clashed with everyone else's suits. He briefly hugged his father, kissed his sister on the cheek, ate a plate of food standing in a far corner, and at 8:30 he left without saying goodbye to anyone. He literally left his own 18th birthday party after being there for 30 minutes. The next day, Chávez looked for him, annoyed but genuinely confused, and asked him directly why he had left so early. Hugo Rafael answered something Chavez later recounted in a private conversation with Irma Marksman, his former partner, which she revealed years later. "Dad, with all due respect, that wasn't my birthday party. That was your political event. I didn't ask for any of that. I just wanted to eat pizza with 5 real friends and watch a movie. But you organized a media circus with drunk ministers who don't even know my full name." That brutally honest answer sums up Hugo Rafael's entire life in a single sentence. He never wanted to be part of the spectacle, and he achieved something that, in hindsight, seems almost impossible: becoming practically invisible while carrying the most visible, most photographed, most analyzed last name in Venezuela. How did he do it? With an obsessive discipline bordering on monastic. In 25 years of his father's intense public life, he never gave a single recorded interview. Not one. Journalists tried hundreds of times. They offered money. They offered full editorial control. They promised to talk only about sports. Hugo Rafael rejected every offer with a simple, polite but firm, "No, thank you." He never had social media of any kind. Not Facebook when it was mandatory. Not Twitter when it dominated political conversation. Not Instagram when it became the platform of the moment. Zero verifiable digital presence. He never attended government political events unless they were completely unavoidable family obligations, like weddings or funerals. And when he did attend those inevitable events, he perfected a technique: staying in the last physical row, avoiding eye contact with cameras, leaving as soon as basic courtesy allowed. His life strategy was simple but extraordinarily effective. Be so media boring that journalists eventually stop looking for you. And it worked. He dedicated himself to sports from adolescence with a passion that was clearly a form of psychological escape. He played baseball in youth leagues in Barinas with real talent, not exceptional enough for the major leagues, but solid, reliable, technically sound. Later, he became interested in soccer when Venezuela began investing in the sport, and eventually found his true calling: teaching sports to children from poor communities. He worked quietly for years in youth baseball programs in Barinas, organized by the governor's office. He ran a local soccer league for kids from marginalized neighborhoods. He personally coached teams of children between 10 and 12 years old. It was his way of contributing socially without becoming a public figure, without giving speeches about social transformation, without posing for official photos, without using his last name as a credential. Parents of the children he coached consistently tell the same things: that he was dedicated and punctual, that he arrived at 6 in the morning to open the field, that he genuinely knew the sport and could teach real technique, that he never used his last name to boast or ask for favors, that he treated every child exactly the same regardless of whether they came from Chavista or opposition families, and that whenever a parent tried to bring up politics, Hugo Rafael would politely cut the conversation short and redirect it back to training. When his father was diagnosed with cancer in 2011 and the final decline began, Hugo Rafael was not part of the inner circle handling privileged medical information. He didn't attend family meetings where decisions were made about what to reveal publicly. He didn't travel to Cuba for the hospital visits his sisters made. He stayed focused on his work in Barinas, on his personal life far from Caracas, on trying to preserve some sense of normality while the entire country panicked. Some criticized him for that. They said he was insensitive, that he abandoned his father at the hardest moment. But those who know him well say he simply couldn't emotionally handle being at the center of that drama, that he processed pain privately, that his way of honoring his father was continuing the work that gave meaning to his life. His father's death on March 5, 2013 hit him deeply, but completely privately and invisibly. He didn't deliver public speeches of mourning. He didn't appear on television crying for the cameras. He didn't become the visible face of national family grief. He attended the state funeral because it was impossible not to. He was present in the chapel during the family hours, but always in the second or third row, deliberately avoiding cameras, always seeking the shadows while others stood in the spotlight. In the years after the Comandante's death, as Venezuela sank into an unprecedented multidimensional crisis, Hugo Rafael retreated even further from any remaining public visibility. He didn't give interviews explaining his perspective on his father's legacy. He didn't write memoirs that publishers offered to buy for millions. He didn't participate in documentaries that would have paid fortunes for his testimony. He didn't use his last name to build a political career of his own, something many observers expected given that the name Chavez still carried electoral power. His decision to stay completely away was conscious, deliberate, philosophically grounded. Hugo Rafael understood something early on that his sisters processed differently, that public exposure destroys any possibility of an authentic life. That being a political symbol means giving up being a person, that the last name Chavez was both a heritage of power and a generational curse, and he chose, as much as humanly possible, to reject that inheritance even though it was guaranteed. He focused obsessively on his private family life, on building personal relationships that had absolutely nothing to do with politics, on everyday routines that allowed him to feel like a normal human being rather than the heir to a historical legacy. He married a woman from Barinas who came from a non-political family and valued his discretion. He had 3 children whom he has fiercely protected from media exposure, trying to give them the normalcy he never fully had. He avoids political events unless family obligation is so absolute that refusing would be an unforgivable insult. In those unavoidable moments, he appears briefly, fulfills the minimum protocol, and disappears as quickly as basic courtesy allows. His current friendships were carefully chosen from people who knew him before his father became president, or from those who genuinely have no interest in politics. People who know him as Hugo, the guy who coaches youth baseball, not Chavez, the son of the eternal comandante. He actively seeks social spaces where he can just be a person with opinions about soccer and movies, not the heir to a revolutionary legacy. The media occasionally tried to turn him into news over the years. They published blurry photos when he appeared at local sporting events. They speculated about his private life without real information. They searched for statements he never gave. But Hugo Rafael maintained an absolutely unbreakable discipline of media silence and never broke it once. He has no active social media accounts. He doesn't grant interviews, not even to pro-government outlets that would guarantee friendly questions. He doesn't write opinion columns or participate in public debates about anything. His absence from the national conversation is so complete that many young Venezuelans born after 2010 don't even know Hugo Chavez had a son. Unlike his sisters, whose lives are constant topics of media discussion and political analysis, Hugo Rafael achieved something that in Venezuela borders on the supernatural, becoming invisible while carrying one of the most famous, most loaded, most symbolic last names in the country's contemporary history. That invisibility was not accidental or the result of irrelevance. It was a deliberate, sustained construction. A life project dedicated to escaping the family myth required constant discipline, the deliberate renunciation of opportunities his last name guaranteed, and the conscious acceptance that he would never have the political influence, social recognition, or economic power that name could have easily given him. For Hugo Rafael, that massive renunciation was worth it if the price was preserving some personal autonomy, some freedom to define himself outside his father's shadow, some space to breathe without being constantly evaluated as someone else's extension. Over the years, as Venezuela transformed in ways no one had anticipated, as millions emigrated and the economic crisis reshaped reality, Hugo Rafael remained unwavering in his silent path. He never publicly commented on the country's situation. Not once. He didn't defend government policies. He didn't criticize the opposition. He didn't become a dissident voice or an orthodox defender of the legacy. His silence was deliberately neutral, almost apolitical, though he knew that silence itself would be interpreted politically by everyone. Some saw it as moral cowardice. Others saw wisdom. The reality was simpler. Hugo Rafael simply didn't want to be part of those conversations. He didn't feel morally obligated to explain or defend his father's decisions. He didn't believe his last name granted him special authority over the fate of millions. He just wanted to live his life, a small, ordinary life. And in the context of his last name, that was the most radical ambition imaginable. He also lived with occasional rumors about his finances, though far less intense than those surrounding María Gabriela. Speculation about how he supported himself, questions about whether he received government money, but because he never lived publicly, never flaunted luxury, Those rumors never gained traction. Today in 2025, Hugo Rafael remains the least known of the three. No scandals, no investigations, no controversial statements, just sustained silence, deliberate distance, and the patient construction of a life far from cameras and mass judgment. It is the story of the son who rejected the destiny others wrote for him, who chose the periphery when his name guaranteed him the center. Proof that it is possible, though extraordinarily difficult, to build a personal identity while carrying a last name that belongs to history books. None of the three siblings could ever fully escape one thing: the invisible but permanent weight of being watched, even when they no longer wanted to be seen. Each found a different way to survive. Rosa Virginia turned political loyalty into the core of her identity. Maria Gabriela fled geographically to protect her mental health. Hugo Rafael chose invisibility. Three answers, three paths. One silent pact united them, never revealing their father's most intimate truths. When the internal struggle over the legacy began, none of them exposed the private conversations, the doubts, the contradictions, the fears he expressed when he believed no one was listening. They kept what belonged only to them as a family. Years later, their silences said more than any statement ever could. Because power fades, history moves on, but its echo remains inside those who inherited it. And the children of Hugo Chávez carry that echo in every step they take, in every decision they make, in every conscious moment of their lives. It is their inheritance and their burden, their privilege and their sentence, their story, their inescapable destiny. If you believe there are still truths buried in the shadows of power, deeply human stories that go beyond ideology, subscribe now. What's coming next was also silenced for years, for reasons you'll soon understand. These are stories of real people living extraordinary circumstances, and they deserve to be told. Not from hate, not from blind worship, but from genuine curiosity about what it means to be human when the world turns you into a symbol.